takes place here. We're very pleased that you're here. We're very excited too about today's event, New England's energy future and its effect on the regional economy. I'd like to remind you to shut off your cell phones and other devices that make noise. Also, just so you know, this event is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel or by DVD if you request it. I'd like to introduce this afternoon's moderator, Michael Sununu. Michael is the co-founder, or is the founder and manager of Profile Strategy Group and Sununu Enterprises. They are both strategic consulting groups based in New Hampshire and Washington, D.C., and specialize in planning and project development for major corporations and medium-sized firms, as well as public relations and government relations services. His work focuses on planning and business development in the energy and infrastructure industries, which includes clients like the largest undersea fiber telecommunications company, major electrical utilities, public safety organizations, and the largest ever Caribbean groundwater development program. I want to hear about that after. Maybe we can take a trip. Previously, Michael worked on Capitol Hill for several members of Congress. As a legislative director, he ran the research division for the Republican Party's Congressional Campaign Committee. Please welcome Michael Sununu.
Thank you very much. I'd like to first thank you all for attending today. Hopefully we'll have a very good program for you, very educational. I also want to take the opportunity to thank Neil and the Institute for hosting us today. I think we have an excellent panel that has a range of experiences in the energy and electricity markets. I think each of our panelists is going to bring us a wealth of experience that we can learn from. In terms of the program, what we're going to be doing is each of the panelists I will introduce, and they'll come up. They'll do a brief 5-10 minute presentation to provide you with some background. After that, we're going to take the opportunity to explore in depth a variety of the issues in the energy and electricity markets through a panel discussion. Finally, we'll be able to take questions from the audience, assuming that we have time at the end of the program. So with that, let me briefly introduce our first panelist today, Ann George. Ann George is from ISO New England. She is currently the Vice President for External Affairs and Corporate Communications, and she's been in that position since November of 2008. In this role, she directs ISO's outreach and communications with public officials, stakeholders, and the media. Prior to joining ISO, Ann served as a commissioner to the Connecticut PUC, and she has also served as the chair of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners Committee on Electricity and as president of the New England Conference of Public Utility Commissioners. And it was very long. She has also served as the Connecticut Governor's Special Counsel on Energy and as a staff attorney to the U.S. Senate. I think she'll provide a great background here on the state of the energy situation here in New England. So with that, Ann, come on up.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I should say Happy New Year. I feel like this is the first day everybody's really back with their brains engaged. So it's a pleasure to be here. It was a lovely drive up to New Hampshire today. I actually have a few more slides than the 5 to 10 minutes, so hopefully I'll go through them fairly quickly. But I was asked to kind of give a state of the state of the energy landscape in New England. So I'll quickly go through these and then we'll look forward to the discussion with the panel. So real brief about ISO New England. I think a lot of you are familiar with the organization, but for those of you who are not, we are the independent, not-for-profit organization that was created to manage the power system in the region. We have 3 primary responsibilities. We operate the power system, minute-to-minute operation of the power system. We administer the wholesale electricity prices and markets, and we plan for the future needs of the system. We look out over a 10-year planning horizon and see what the system will need, and we make the arrangements to plan with our New England stakeholders in the New England states for those needs. So a quick snapshot of the region. We have approximately 32,000 megawatts of installed capacity in the region, and approximately, up here it says 1850 megawatts of demand resources. That number fluctuates a little bit depending on the market, but we're generally in that 2,000 megawatt range for demand resources. We have 13 interconnections with our neighbors, and we really do work closely with our neighbors in New York, Quebec, and New Brunswick. I'll talk a little bit about the total costs in the energy market, but you can see there in 2012, which was the last final number I have, it was $5 billion in the energy market, in the wholesale energy market. So ISO New England, given our independent, not-for-profit status, we do not own any of the resources in the region, and we really are in a unique spot to see what's happening through our operations of the system, through our planning for the system, and in our market outcomes. And so a few years ago, we saw some challenges emerging. And as we began discussions internally on those challenges, we saw the interrelationship between them. And we took this to our stakeholders in the New England states to really start talking about the issues and hopefully to get everyone in the region interested and motivated to come up with solutions to address these challenges. The two that really stood out as the most critical, urgent challenges to meet were number one and number two, the resource performance and flexibility, and our increased reliance on natural gas. The others are coming, and we actually, and I'll talk a little bit about the retirement of generators. We saw this coming, and now we are seeing the applications for retirement coming in to ISO New England. So while we saw these on the horizon, now we're in the horizon. So it's been interesting in 2013, and I think 2014 we're just going to start to see even more activity dealing with the evolving resource mix in New England. So on the role of natural gas, I think everybody in the region, I hope at this point, is very well aware of this issue. We have transformed our fleet over the last decade, and it really is predominantly natural gas fired generation now. You see from this pie chart that we have over 50% of our electricity generation is produced from our natural gas resources, and that those natural gas resources are really pushing the oil and coal out of the market. You can see that there's very little electricity generation over a period of time, over a year, from that oil and gas fleet. However, I will point out that on certain critical days and critical periods, the oil and gas fleet is vitally important to maintaining the reliability of the system. And if we look at what's showing an interest to build in the region, it really is more natural gas and then wind. And I'll talk a little bit about the wind and the policies that are promoting the wind resource development in the region. So on cost, I wanted to show, because there's a lot of confusion about wholesale electricity costs and where they're coming from. So I wanted to show what are the different components of the wholesale electricity markets and what are the big buckets of costs. And as you can see from the blue bar, the primary component is the energy market, and that's the daily purchase and selling of energy and the management of the daily markets. And you'll see that in 2008, that was our high water mark for the energy market costs, and that was over $12 billion. But in 2012, as I mentioned earlier, they had dropped down to $5 billion. So there's a $7 billion swing in the energy market price in that 4-year period. Other components that you hear a lot about are capacity market, the green bar, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the changes that we're seeing with the capacity market. And then the ancillary services market, which is really to make sure that we have reserves for any contingencies on the system. And then finally, transmission. We've heard a lot about transmission. There's been an increased investment in transmission in the region over the past decade or so, and that really followed years of underinvestment in transmission. And this has been transmission to meet reliability standards that we are required to meet in order to maintain reliable operation of the system. So, on the wholesale electricity prices, we have seen, and I think a lot of people have already seen this slide. We show it almost every presentation that ISO New England gives. Natural gas, the price of natural gas really does drive the price of wholesale electricity in New England. Natural gas being the resource that clears the market, most often it sets the price for all of the resources in the region. And so as you see where natural gas prices rise, so do our wholesale electricity prices. And if you notice, a lot of those spikes that you see happen in the winter months. And we're seeing more of that happening. Last winter, we saw some dramatic price spikes driven by the price of natural gas. There was one point last winter where the price of natural gas in New England was about 10 times the price of natural gas in other parts of the country. So you have those dramatic price spikes, and the reason you have those dramatic price spikes is because of our infrastructure. And I've been to other conferences where I see a similar map, and if you had a similar map up there for the Midwest region or for Texas, you would see pipelines crisscrossing the area. Well, we're somewhat limited in New England. We have 5 gas pipelines, and the pipelines from the south and west really are full or near full almost on a daily basis. And so whenever the pipelines are constrained, you see those price spikes. And so that's what's happening. We do have the LNG facilities that do provide gas supplies to the region, but LNG is much more expensive than the lower cost shale natural gas. And so you see a lot of the electricity generators really trying to source their fuel source from the lower cost shale region, and we're experiencing those constraints. So this picture really tells the story. This was an editorial cartoon from the Hartford Courant, my home state of Connecticut, and it's never good to have an issue in an editorial cartoon, but here we are, and it really, in very succinct terms, shows the issue. Connecticut is one of those states, as many of the New England states are trying to get residential and businesses to switch from oil to natural gas for heating and in other purposes. And as they do that, they're using up the slack that did exist in the pipelines. And once they do that, then there's really nothing left over for the electric generators that don't have the contract rights to use the pipelines the way that the home heating customers do. And so we really are seeing this play out, and it leaves all of us wondering, what will it take to build new pipeline capacity into the region? Because all of those price spikes are just going to continue until we start to see additional capacity into the region. So that's the natural gas situation. We also are seeing the evolution of our resource mix driven by public policy. And on one front, we see a lot of distributed generation. And distributed generation's been around here for a while, but we've seen a tremendous amount of growth primarily in solar PV panels. We started working with the New England states and the stakeholders to understand what was being built, what the policies were pushing, and we did this so that we could understand, because this is really, these are resources that we don't have much visibility into. And so we wanted to understand what was happening so that when we do our planning for the transmission needs for the system, we don't overbuild the system, we understand what's out there. And so we've just kicked off this process, and we hope to have a distributed generation forecast available for the 2014 regional system plan, which we do every year, which lays out the system needs. Energy efficiency is another area that the states really have invested a tremendous amount of money into. They are spending billions on energy efficiency, and I think the states are constantly in competition with who can spend more money on energy efficiency. But as they were spending billions on energy efficiency, that was another area we said, we've got to understand what is happening with energy efficiency. And some of this does come through our markets, our capacity markets, so we do see some of it. But some of it in the out years, we don't know what's coming. And so as we plan for the transmission needs, we really need to understand what's happening on the energy efficiency front and what impact that has on our load forecast. So we've done this, and we've seen some of the, already seen some of the benefits from these investments, pushing off needed transmission projects in the region. The RPS, obviously, the renewable energy goals from the states, and also the energy efficiency and other factors have had dramatic impact on the emissions in the region. We're seeing that because of the policy choices, we're seeing it because oil and coal are being knocked out of the market, and the lower load forecast. And then I mentioned there's a lot of wind being proposed in the region, primarily driven by those renewable energy goals. And you'll see that in Maine is where the majority are located. Now, Maine is a great resource for wind, but there's very little transmission up there. And so if all of this was to be developed, you would need transmission to get it down to the load centers if you wanted it to run. Right now, we have approximately 750 megawatts of wind installed in New England, and it really doesn't run at its full potential, oftentimes because of the limitations of the transmission system. So any additional wind is going to be challenged, especially in areas like Maine. So I mentioned retirements being one of those challenges that we were seeing. We have a lot of older oil, coal units, 40, 50-year-old units in New England. And as we looked at those and said, you know what, we could be faced with a wave of retirements in this region. What would that mean to New England? We studied this a couple of years ago, and we came out with some findings that because of the transmission investments that the region has made, we think we can handle the retirement of some of these. So some of these could retire and we wouldn't need to replace or repower them. However, about 6,000 megawatts or so would need to be replaced or repowered in some fashion in order to meet the capacity requirement needs for the region. You can see here that we've started to get those retirement requests, as I mentioned. And it's been mainly the coal and oil fired plants, but Vermont Yankee Nuclear Facility also indicated its desire to retire. So we're seeing these happen. I think we expected it. Some might have been more expected than others, and the timing of some might have been more expected than others. But we're seeing, we saw this coming, and this is really starting to change the nature of the landscape, both on a resource basis, but also on a market basis. We're about to run our 8th forward capacity auction next month, and we'll see what happens with the resources that have retired, and then what the market actually brings forward in terms of new resources to cover these retirements. So the transmission, briefly, the the reliability projects have been spread around the region. They meet the reliability needs, and they are continuing to be finalized in some areas, but they really have been in every state where we've seen these reliability needs. And as I mentioned, it's facilitated the moving around of the power in the system, makes for a much more efficient dispatch of the resources in the region, and also allows for some of those retirements to take place. This, I know in this state in particular, there's been a lot of discussion about Northern Pass, but there are many projects that are being discussed out there that are not reliability projects, but are projects that merchant developers are thinking about and seeking to develop. And so this is the list. ISO New England doesn't really have an active role in these projects. We don't advocate for one of these projects over another, but we do have to review them to ensure that they won't have an adverse impact on the region if they were to get built and interconnected into the system. And so that's the role we play, and we'll see what, if any, of these projects gets developed. So all of those challenges, this evolution of resources in the region, really has led us to a point where we needed to do something. The natural gas concerns, the limitations on the current infrastructure for natural gas raised some operating challenges last winter. And not only did we have the price spikes, but we also had some operational days where it was very concerning to understand and to see what the generation fleet was able to access in terms of natural gas supplies. So we embarked on this discussion with the states and our stakeholders on a program that would be in place just for this winter. And it wasn't anybody's ideal program. It's an out-of-market purchase of oil inventory. But we really did feel like we needed to do it. It needed to be an insurance policy for this winter. And so it's in place now, and our control room has said they've already seen benefits from having this in place. We will do a report after the winter on the success of the program, but it is something that early on, especially with early cold weather that we've had in this region, we've seen the benefits of having the oil inventory in place. But on the long term, we do see the need to make changes to our forward capacity market. That's the market that really sends the signal for investment in the region. And as you see the changes in our resource mix, the retirements, we really do need to make sure that those incentives are right and strong, and so they can bring forward the right resources. And so we've put together some changes to the forward capacity market. We're planning to make a filing with our federal energy regulators in the next week or so. And it really comes down to a core design principle of paying for power when it's delivered, and when it's delivered during critical time periods. It's kind of not great to be up here saying that our current capacity market doesn't do this, but our current capacity market rules were the result of a settlement, and we've got some rules that don't necessarily work in the way that they should and the way that they were intended. So what we're trying to do is make sure that when the resources perform, they get paid. If they don't perform, they don't get paid. And so it's a pretty simple concept, but it doesn't have a lot of support in the region, and we'll see what FERC does with it. But we do think that it's vitally important to have this in place because of this resource evolution, and because the existing resource fleet really isn't making the investments needed to ensure that they'll be reliable for the near term. So that's something that we feel is very important. And then finally, I think others on the panel will probably touch on this. In terms of the infrastructure, our markets really aren't sending signals for long-term investment in infrastructure. These are 20, 30-year investments that need to be made, and our markets are shorter-term markets. So the governors have gotten together. They've said, okay, well, what does this mean? Can we work together and figure out how the 6 states can, whether they make a joint investment, however they decide to pursue this, but they really wanted to say, banding together, can we find solutions to natural gas pipeline infrastructure and transmission, primarily for the public policy goals that they're trying to meet. So with that, I'll stop. I'll just point out that we do have a lot of information on our website and our ISO app, So if you want to follow what's happening in the market, you can click on that and follow along with Sally. So thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Following up on what she said, I highly recommend the ISO to go back. I have it on my smartphone and I look at it every day. Our next presenter will be Dan Ford. Dan is Managing Director and Head of North American Utilities Equity Research at Barclays Capital. In this position, he and his team are responsible for research coverage on a group of 48 energy stocks. Prior to joining Barclays in September 2008, Mr. Ford served as Managing Director at Lehman Brothers, covering the U.S. electricity industry and power industries. Previously, he covered electric utility stocks at ABN AMRO, HSBC Securities, Dean Witter, Merrill Lynch, and at Morgan Stanley. He's had more than 15 years experience in the industry and has received a number of awards. Most recently, he was ranked first in the 2013 Institutional Investor All-Star Analyst Survey, and he's been ranked in the top 3 since 2001. So with that, I'll have Dan come up and present for you.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. And in spite of that resume, which tells you 2 things. First, I can't keep a job. 6 or 7 things there. I happen to live in New England. I'm a Mainer. And in light of that, I've come up with really, a slogan for this conference, which is what New England really needs in energy: safer, cleaner, cheaper. And if we can all get there, we'll be very successful. I think Ann really laid out what the infrastructure needs are and why they're needed. What I'm here to do is to tell you what can get paid for. I represent institutional investors that would invest in projects to bring solutions to the energy problems of New England. For my clients who are looking for these investment opportunities, we see some modest investments in the New England area. However, we do think that they could be a great deal more robust. Some of the things that stand in the way are policy issues. Some of them are simply regional and infrastructure issues that have existed for quite some period of time. If we're armed with a transparent and timely policy enhancements, we think that some of these things can be overcome, though. So let me lay out for you what the investment opportunities are in New England, what ones are getting paid for right now, and what ones need some assistance in order to get done in the future. What we see is 4 real investment themes for energy in New England. One is ripe for investment today, and in fact has been getting invested in for the last several years. One is emerging, but the pieces are in place for that investment to take place, and then 2 need some help. First, the investable thought. Reliability-based transmission is and has been a very lucrative investment for my shareholders for the last 5 or 6 years. There is a very understandable risk-reward system through FERC rates. There is a very clear project clearing and approval process from ISO New England. And right now, the only thing that is in any way holding up some of the investments that should be made come down to some individual siting issues which are localized, as well as an ongoing review that's lasted, in our opinion, far too long at the FERC around the appropriate level of rates of return on equity. It's hard to make an investment unless you have an idea of what your return might look like. The emerging investment opportunity is natural gas for distribution and industrial users. There's a real opportunity for significant savings for customers if only we have access to natural gas supplies from the shale regions in the Marcellus and Utica, which are in Pennsylvania and Ohio. What we need in order to make this a reality is more pipeline capacity. There are several proposals that have been made, they can be paid for and actually reduce costs to the region, because the basis or the spread between what we pay in New England and what gets paid just a couple hundred miles south of here is very substantial. The first place that gas is going to go, and Ann talked about this, is the residential and industrial user, because they can sign long-term firm contracts and make that economic for themselves. It's probably the single biggest energy infrastructure tax break that you could give to a New Englander to have them switch from oil heat in the wintertime to natural gas at market rates. It's about $2,000 a winter, and that would go back into the economy. Connecticut has done an extremely good job with a thoughtful set of proposals to try to move that forward. The only thing that's standing in the way of much more rapid deployment of natural gas really comes down to who pays for it. The way that the natural gas distribution system works in most of New England right now is that the end user pays for the upgrade, or largely does. If that can be socialized over the rest of the system because it enhances the region and the economy of the region, we'd see an awful lot more pipe in the ground. The third investment idea, which really isn't ready for prime time, is large-scale renewable transmission and renewable projects. That's exactly because of the logistics problem, which is the wind blows in the hills of Maine. Hydro is in the eastern portion of Canada, and we don't have good linkages to either. Merchant transmission projects are very difficult to site in New England because of the ability to oppose them vigorously and have quite a deal of success. There was a list of several projects up on the board a little bit earlier. I'd say on average most of those projects have been on paper or in a proposed state for anywhere from 5 to 10 years, and none of them are done. It's very likely that the first one to get done, if it gets through some very major hurdles, will be Northern Pass, and that's in 2017, 2018. And no matter what your position on Northern Pass is, one thing happens to be true. It's actually not being paid for by anybody in New England. And so from an economic standpoint, it's a no-brainer. Hydro-Quebec pays for it. Hydro-Quebec sends the power down here, and if it's not market-based or below, then it just won't get used. And so it really comes down to a matter of property rights and natural beauty in the northern part of New Hampshire. The final thing that's really not ready for prime time right now, because we don't have a system that adequately compensates for it, and frankly we don't anywhere in the United States, is baseload generation. Right now the capacity markets that exist are flawed in our view. The flaw is very basic. What we are asking generators to do and investors and financiers to pay for is a 30-year lived asset on 1-year promise of payment. That just doesn't work. That's not something that I encourage my investors to put their money in, and so that's why we really haven't seen any material baseload generation in New England and frankly in the United States in deregulated markets. They were deregulated. We need to find a solution to that. I think some of the proposals that are in front of the FERC, in front of this spring's auction, are a start. We believe that the auction process should probably cover a longer period of time. It should likely not be a vertical demand curve, but rather a smooth curve. We also think that this would help retaining some of the generation in support of reliability that's going to be shut down in the next several years in the region. Overall, I'm very hopeful that some of these problems will be addressed. I think that there's a real opportunity for what is the most expensive energy region in the United States to get a lot better. And as any of you who are in business know, it's not always the cheapest place that wins, it's the place that's improving the most rapidly. And New England has a heck of an opportunity to improve. I look forward to our discussion this afternoon. I hope it will allow me to see some more opportunities to direct my investors towards in this region, because as I remind you, that's my region too. Thank you.
Brian is Vice President for the Fidelity Real Estate Company. He has had over 25 years of experience in the field of energy and engineering and is currently Vice President for Fidelity Investments. Brian is responsible for managing the unregulated electricity supply for about 70 megawatts for the companies to serve Fidelity Investments and their affiliates here in the United States. Mr. Daigle is also responsible for the operation of Fidelity's solar energy assets and sourcing new investments nationally in this space. Prior to Fidelity, he held positions in engineering project management and energy consulting. He holds a BS in mechanical engineering, an MBA from Bentley, and is a registered professional engineer for Maine, Massachusetts, and in Connecticut. So with that, Brian, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you. Welcome today. So as you mentioned before, one of my primary responsibilities at Fidelity is to purchase its power nationally, and we spend about $70 million on energy nationally. So constantly, I am always faced with the challenge of trying to source that power from a cheaper source. One of the this challenge has been in existence since the beginning of time. You always want to sort of reduce your expenses. So that's how this position materialized within Fidelity Investments. We took it one step further, moving along, and after dealing with many retail suppliers in the nation, or especially in New England, in the restructured markets and the deregulated markets, we felt that we could do things better ourselves. And so ultimately, we created an unregulated retail supply company where we purchase our own power on the wholesale market and then sell it back to the companies internally. And we've been doing that for about 3 years now, and that's my primary role. Is I operate a retail electricity supply company that serves Fidelity Investments and its internal customers and affiliate companies. There's another company up there you'll see. The name of the company is called Devonshire Energy. We call it the CEP, Competitive Electricity Provider. I think that's a name that came from Maine, ultimately, so we dubbed it and used it internally. One of our operating companies is a large hydroponic tomato operation in Maine called Backyard Farms. We have a separate retail company that supplies power for it also. But all in all, the two combined are about 70 megawatts of power sourced annually on the hourly markets, day ahead or real-time markets. So it's quite a challenge. But the purpose of doing creating these entities and getting into this complexity was really for cost savings. We believe that we can beat the market, or at least beat the retail market. Although the margins are thin, and our savings projections are getting less and less as the years go by. Because the way we benchmark our performance is really the only other rate that we can look at is the default rate. We look at the default price of power or the standard offer, whatever state that we operate in, and we sort of compare that. So we've been able to beat that. The past couple of years, we've done some hedging and we've gotten beaten on some hedges, but ultimately, all in all, for the past 4 years, we've saved about 13% of our annual retail spend. I created this slide just internally to sort of communicate to folks what I actually do for my daily duties. I don't think anyone still understands what I do within the company. This is just my attempt at showing what before and after deregulation. And the only reason why Devonshire Energy and Backyard Farms Energy can exist is because of the deregulated market and supplier choice. So this is just a little supply chain. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this, and if you're not. And so you can see where our two companies, I think there's a pointer here. You can see our two companies, Devonshire Energy and Backyard Farms. So we're treated just like a regular retail supplier in this region, and we operate the same way. We have renewable power obligations and all the fun stuff that goes along with it. So it's a pretty complicated process, but we feel it's worth it at the end of the day. These are the regions that we operate in. We mostly New England. We have some real estate assets in District of Columbia, so we're active in PJM interconnection. I can say that the market is much more stable down there than it is in New England, as you all know. Moving forward, this is a slide that we saw earlier today. Very similar, very similar pain that we're feeling at the pump, if you will. We're in the day-ahead market for all our energy, day-ahead and real-time market, and so we're exposed to real-time prices hourly. And these are the prices that we've seen settled, for the past 3 years, past 5 years actually. And it hasn't been this bad for us since 05, which is post Hurricane Katrina. When we saw the commodity prices, natural gas was $15 or so. So it was pretty significant event. And then 08, there was a commodities boom in 08, which you saw there. But other than that, everything's been on a steady decline until everyone decided that suddenly natural gas is constrained getting into New England. So now we got the situation that we're in now. If we look at the forward market prices here, I think the good news here is that, if there's any good news at all about this, is that it's really isolated to the winter months, specifically Q1. These are Q1, Q4, Q2, Q1, Q2, Q4 prices. And you can see, once we get out of Q1, everything pretty much stabilizes. And that's the message that I'm going to that I will communicate internally, and saying we need to get through these winter months, but after the winter months, everything settles down. Hopefully the weather will play a role with us, but it's a painful process for us, and I have quite a bit of explaining to do internally as to what's going on. We're supposed to be managing the store here, and we're paying these exorbitant prices, but the problem is that everyone, as you all know, is exposed to the same market. So there's not a lot we can do about it. From my perspective, though, it was interesting because we set budgets. We set budgets at the end of Q3 in 2013, just 3 months ago, and in the hourly energy price, I had budgeted about 13.9 million for and then 3 months later, at the end of Q4, price, we saw a 33% increase, unfavorable variance in our budget. And I just asked, what happened? It never ceases to amaze me how the markets work, and obviously the markets are very efficient and they take all available information to sort of adjust their prices, but it's very difficult to sort of comprehend what happened there. And if you look back on my prior slide, the same deal. Here we were here. We were thinking around here, oh my goodness, this is not a good time to hedge, or this is not a good time to buy power because the prices are high. They've been high forever. If I'd only had the foresight to maybe place a hedge or buy a power swap then, I would have been in much better shape now. So, moving forward, the challenge for us is just going to be try to manage this as best as we can. Our goal is to always constantly, I'm always professing that we should hedge internally. We hedge through financial swaps because we're a financial services institution. So the management, they understand the swap, and so we've done that traditionally. The goal is to try to figure out when to buy a swap, and I'm always, just like anyone in the power industry, you're always buying. You can never time the market. So it's hopefully in a few years we will see these pipeline constraints alleviate the situation a little bit, but I think that we're in for a rough patch moving forward. And I thank you for your time here today.
Our last presenter today is going to be Dr. Lisa Shapiro. Many of you in the room, I think, know Lisa. She's well known in New Hampshire. She's chief economist at Gallagher, Callahan & Cottrell in Concord. She analyzes economic and industry trends and works with businesses on strategic and economic issues. For more than 20 years, she's been involved in the energy, healthcare, infrastructure, and economic development issues, certainly here in New Hampshire. She is a former chairman of the board of the New Hampshire Retirement System. Dr. Shapiro is also a former member of the Federal Reserve Bank at Boston, New England's Public Policy Center Advisory Board, and also at the Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy here in New Hampshire. She holds a PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins, a Master of Science in Resource Economics from the University of Maryland, and she completed her undergraduate degree at Cornell University. With that, Dr. Shapiro.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So I'm the last for the presenting. Get to be talk about the economic impacts of what you've been hearing for the last hour or so. So the first thing you might want to say is, well, the economy has changed so much over the last 40 years. We're less energy intensive, a lot less energy per dollar GDP. So do we really care about energy costs in the economy anymore? Well, we just heard from Fidelity, who's putting a lot of effort in his job to make sure they find the bottom line and are looking for cost savings. So the answer is yes, it still does matter. And why does it matter? First, when we think about energy costs and how they impact the economy, think about it first from the consumer perspective. Consumer spending is maybe 2/3 of the economy, and when energy costs go up, that means less disposable income to spend on anything else. And what's happened to median family income over the last decade have stagnated, declined in some areas, and yet when energy costs are rising, that means there's less available for other expenditures, and that hurts everybody. On the business side, obviously it's a cost of doing business. And for New England, it's been our comparative disadvantage for many years. So has anything changed recently to make us feel better about the outlook? So I'll give you some bad news and some good news. For the good news, unfortunately, most of that is looking in the rearview mirror. From 2010 to 2012, New England energy prices actually declined about 6%. That's good news. And not only did they decline, we actually narrowed our gap above the national average. We're still, as of the end of 2012, over 40% above the national average. So not a pretty picture, but it had come down from the more than 50% just a few years earlier. So that's some good news looking in the past. But as I mentioned, in terms of the overall expenditures on energy, it's still significant for businesses and households, and it runs about 8 to 9% of national gross domestic product. So that's a big area, and it impacts businesses and households. And 2013, here's the bad news, the data's just starting to come in. We're only 6 days into the new year, so it'll take a little while for everything to shake out. But I just got on some sites this morning to see if we can get some snapshot of last year. And the preliminary numbers coming out of Washington are that natural gas futures for 2013 compared to 2012 were 29% higher. So there goes our 6% savings. And electricity costs look like they're going to be in the 5 to 15% increase. So that's impacting folks. What's more troubling for New England, as we know it's always been our comparative disadvantage, was the high energy costs, is that on the industrial side, if we just look not at electric costs across all sectors, commercial, transportation, residential, but just at the industrial sector, in New England, electricity prices are 77% higher than the national average. No other region comes close. I'm not talking about Alaska and Hawaii. They're off the continent. So not to focus on that. I mean, that is much higher than the 40% because of the residential and the commercial aren't hit quite as hard. So really where it counts in terms of industrial costs, we really are at such a comparative disadvantage. And one thing to keep in mind is that we look at the change in the manufacturing sector, and some of the numbers we're looking at are maybe 50–60% of manufacturing jobs, and at least that on gross domestic product are coming out of the advanced manufacturing, so into precision technology, medical equipment, computer equipment, and away from the traditional energy-intensive manufacturing. But the previous speaker is not from the old economy, he's from the new economy with Fidelity, and it's still a factor that drives costs. And something that's important for northern New England especially is we still have the energy-intensive traditional paper-based economy. And we've had a really good story in the last few years of investments in upgrading the equipment, reopening of these factories, much more computerized, more high-tech, investments in natural gas to be able to try and lower costs. And unfortunately, with these spikes that we've been hearing about from the 3 previous speakers, we've seen announcements from 20 to 50 layoffs at one facility, Other facilities aren't talking about the exact numbers, but doing some rough math, we're looking at hundreds of jobs that are going to be impacted because of the price spike. So it may only be a temporary winter thing. It may only be something for 3 or 4 or 5 years. But when those spikes happen, it affects real people and what they're able to buy and do for their own families. And more importantly, not only is the price now an issue from the economic side, but the volatility of what's going on with the price, the lack of predictability. Because for these folks that are facing higher prices, how do you plan for the future? How do you plan for an investment for something that's going to make your facility more efficient when you're not sure of the return because you don't know whether your electric prices are going to go up by a factor of 1 or 2? And that's just too much volatility. So there really is a new risk to the economy in our future in New England, because not only with the high prices, but the volatility. And I'll just wrap this up, and I know Michael wants to get to a good discussion and hear from the audience. New England, the most recent outlook for the economy for New England is no longer leading. We're projected to have economic growth and jobs and income lagging the national average as a region. Yet we have tremendous opportunities on the advanced manufacturing side and in other areas because of the confluence of the educated and technology and the comparative advantages we do have in the region. And so there is a great opportunity with the right type of investments to address what the previous speakers have talked to make sure that we can get that future and not lag behind the nation. And I'll end with a couple of notes on what kind of job impacts are we talking about. I did kind of a quick survey of what happens when you have a $100 million increase in electric costs in New England. And the forecasts that I see, all kinds of different studies, are somewhere between 500 and 800 jobs lost, permanent jobs lost, for each sustained $100 million increase in electric prices. On the other hand, investments in infrastructure can really pay off in sustained and growing jobs. The New England Council did a study about 15 months ago on investing in all types of infrastructure, not just energy, but communications and workforce and other sorts of infrastructure. And they estimated a relationship that for each $1 billion that New England invests in smart infrastructure, they're projecting a 27,000 or as much as a 27,000 increase in jobs. And that's not the construction jobs, that's the permanent jobs beyond that. So we have a future that we can impact, but energy costs have been our comparative disadvantage, and I think it's important that we find the ways to address the problems that folks have been identifying so we don't end up falling farther behind. Thank you.
Let me start by asking Ann, you talked about the upcoming retirements and where we're going with respect to generation in the region. Certainly, the last several months have shown a lot of volatility in the pricing. We seem to be extremely reliable right now on cold days on our oil generation, coal generation. Yet those are the units, thousands of megawatts are facing retirement here. How do we get to this, from that point to the point where we may end up with the infrastructure, natural gas pipeline infrastructure, which people talk about coming on hopefully 2017, 2018. And how does ISO view the way to bridge that gap?
Well, one of the things that we looked at when we were looking at the potential retirements heading our way, we said, okay, well, at least in New England, we have the forward capacity market. And so we get sort of advance notice of resources that are seeking to retire. So that helps us. Some of the other regions don't have that advance notice. So that helps us at least start to prepare for this eventuality where we're going to have these resources go away. And so we see the key to replacing those resources being our forward capacity market. And that's why I stressed the importance of changing the rules so that the incentives are right for those investment decisions that need to be made in order to build in this region. I think the infrastructure decisions that need to be made can play into that as well. Resource owners may not choose to develop in the region if they don't see a robust infrastructure. But there are a few pipeline expansion projects on the books. One project appears to be going forward. That's the AIM project on the Spectra pipeline, and that I believe is scheduled to be in service 2016-17 time period. But hopefully there will be more. And so if we're talking about resources leaving the markets now, we really are talking about those power years 2016, 17, 18, where we will start to see resources leave the market, but hopefully we'll have additional infrastructure built by then, as well as new entrants coming into the market.
You mentioned the change in the capacity market, which Dan, I think you were focused on. Can you describe really what change that would take place, and from an investment standpoint, how you see a potential change in the capacity market that you envision driving some more of the investment that seems to be crucial to what we need in the region?
Sure. The capacity market right now has a vertical demand curve, so it's essentially digital. You get paid full cost of capital net of energy margin, or you get paid nothing, essentially. Now it's more complex than that because there are caps and floors, but essentially that's the way it works. And so the way that the capacity market works now is in February there'll be an auction. You'll line up all of your resources and all of your demand, and you'll clear at a reserve margin. If the reserve margin is in excess, the resource will get paid very little, which encourages them not to invest in their plant. It encourages them in some cases to give shutdown notices and subsequent planning periods. If we get the other side, there's a hope that on 1 year of capacity price visibility, money will flood in and people will build billion-dollar power plants. I'm skeptical that that'll actually happen. I think that the market needs a more sustained view of those prices being high enough not to give an excessive return. What we're talking about is a return that's consistent with the type of risk we take in a power plant, which is about a 15% ROE on 50% equity, or slightly higher on an alternative leverage structure. In order to get there, we think the capacity market ideally would have multiple year outcomes. It would be smooth, so you wouldn't face a everything or nothing type of an auction result. And there's also a related issue that you alluded to in gas infrastructure, which requires firm capacity on the gas pipeline. Because right now, if you did build that incremental piece of infrastructure, the way that the economics work as a power plant, you wouldn't take firm supply. So on the coldest day of the winter, when everyone else is using the gas and there's a curtailment, you actually wouldn't run. Which gets back to Ann's point about paying for the capacity when it's needed, not just all the time.
Brian, let me ask you this question. Since you're really straddled the fence here, you've made investments in the region to some extent on the power side. You're certainly a large user. And you've talked about some of the critical issues that you have to address now, and I think probably several members of our audience as large industrial users probably face similar questions. How has your energy decisions changed over the last 3 to 5 years? And given the environment that certainly we've talked about here, how do you think it's going to, is it going to be different for the next 3 to 5 years for you? Are you going to be making different decisions about either the way that you're acquiring your energy, how you hedge it, what investments you make, not only on the energy side, but in terms of the businesses? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yes. I mean, moving forward, the way we buy energy, per se, I'm not sure if that's actually going to change significantly or has changed. I think it's going to be more the communication internally is the problem that we face. I think the market is the market, and so if we're taking power from the wholesale market in the hourly, day ahead, real-time markets, we're exposed to that price. The communication of that is critical internally, and when we have done hedges, we have put financial hedges in place to help manage that volatility. That's where sort of the communications campaign takes place in doing so. And so what I'm always professing internally is that, as I mentioned before, is that we should always be hedging, we should always be buying power, we should always be buying swaps in the forward market, regardless of what the price is, because we just never know what the future is going to face. I did mention that we are looking at, because we're a retail supplier in Massachusetts and New England, we're exposed to the renewable portfolio standards in New England, so we have to buy renewable power. That was the incentive for us to get into. We have a couple small pilot solar investments that we built in Massachusetts under a megawatt size, very small rooftop systems, and we've looked into that because of the price of renewable power so high. And moving forward, I think that's going to be the bigger challenge is the renewable portfolio standards in the respective states that we operate. There's constant increasing price pressure in those components. And that's a large. We're going to be spending about almost $1.6 million in renewable power this year alone in New England. And so moving forward, we're looking at other investments to sort of use renewable power as a natural hedge. Naturally, these investments are heavily incented with government and tax incentives, and that's an area that we're looking to potentially be a long-term owner and a much larger play moving forward. So.
Well, you mentioned the renewables, and certainly renewable power a lot of it is driven by the regulatory environment, the government side of the equation, either through the RPS mandates or through direct subsidies that will support the construction of those types of systems. Lisa, looking at kind of the regulatory role of government and how it's driving the economics of power, of electricity here in the region, are there issues that you think are, let's say, contributing more to the increase in price due to that involvement? Are there areas where the government is actually helping the situation? Maybe you can talk a little bit about what's going on regulatorily, not only in New England, but also here in New Hampshire specifically.
Well, I think one of the issues about the regulatory environment is that clearly the renewables wouldn't be where they are without the incentives. I mean, they were starting in 2010. There was a desire to really increase the amount of renewables we have, and they're just not going to make it in the market at the time. The hope is that by having these subsidies, they're not there forever, but that they change the market dynamics. And I think that's the question. I think in some types of renewables, we haven't seen that change, but in others, it's been unbelievable. I mean, the price decline in solar PV over the last 2 or 3 years has just been so dramatic that, now we're looking at maybe 7 or 8 cent power for solar, where we used to be looking at, 14, 15 cents a very short time ago. So I think that if the incentives are designed to induce change in technology to be able to ramp up and reduce costs, then it's something that ends up where we get to the other side of the cost equation. Similarly, on energy efficiency, just in terms of like a change in the long term, with the ramp up in energy efficiency, it's directly related to your bill. You're now paying more. There's a proposal in New Hampshire to double the level of subsidies. So as a pricing component, it absolutely is increasing costs. The question is over time, with enough investments, are you actually going to reduce your costs to make up for it? Now, a few years ago, when RPS, for example, came into New Hampshire, the costs were estimated to be very high. RGGI, similarly, going into energy efficiency. But what we see is that it's really, in the short run, it's just a cost increase, except for those who benefit. So if you yourself and your business and you're able to make the investment, then you're going to capture the savings. But for those customers that aren't taking advantage of net metering, that aren't taking advantage of energy efficiency, in the short to medium term, they're just paying the increased price. So there is a lot with government policy about shifting the resources. I mean, take something for the biomass industry, very important in northern New England. Well, everybody's paying more to support the biomass industry, but on the other side, we have more jobs in the logging sector, which trickles through the economy as well. So a lot of the policies, depending on where you sit, are moving money around from one group of players to the other. That's in the worst part about it from the economic perspective, where we can actually change technology and lower costs. And then unfortunately on the other side, each business and homeowner to be able to get in to get the direct benefit, so they're not just paying the increased cost for the subsidy, they're actually seeing some of the reductions. But there's no question that it is one of the drivers of price increases.
One of the things, Michael,
Sure.
just as we're starting to see more and more variable resources come onto the system, we haven't really experienced the challenges in New England yet, but you see them playing out in California, you see them playing out in Germany and other European countries, where the subsidized resources are really driving out the other resources that you need to keep around in order to maintain the reliability of the system. And so I think we're going to see this play out in some of these other regions first, but as we see more and more variable resources come on, it's going to be interesting to see how that interacts with traditional resources that are clearing in the markets without so much of the subsidies and the policy goals behind it.
Well, you mentioned that, and I think you showed the graph earlier where the queue right now is made up of basically two things. Natural gas, which we're capacity constrained, so building more gas right now probably doesn't alleviate the volatilities that we see certainly in the winter months, at least for the next several years. And the rest of it is wind power. And which, to your point, I think raises a couple questions. One is the intermittency issue and how ISO gets to manage on-off resources on a minute-by-minute basis. But it also raises the issue of the investment required to get those resources and make them economical, because we're building 1,300 megawatts of wind in northern Maine. We're going to have to build large-scale transmission to bring it down to the load centers. It sounds to me like ISO, while you don't make decisions about what generation gets built, you certainly there would be an interest to at least keep around some of the traditional baseload. And I noticed over the last week, Brayton Point, ISO said, no, we really don't want you to retire Brayton Point by 2017. Can you talk about kind of those decisions and how ISO is viewing, well, we have these resources coming in the queue, we have these retirements, how you manage who stays and who goes?
Sure. Well, each resource that is seeking to leave our markets and retire we do a review, we do a reliability review to determine the reliability impact of that resource leaving. So Brayton Power, which is a coal and oil plant in Massachusetts, southeastern Massachusetts, submitted the request to retire. We reviewed it, and we said, if you do leave, there will be reliability consequences. And so we'd really prefer if you didn't retire. It's up to the resource owner and what they do with that determination. But it does start a process where we look at what the system will need to allow that resource to leave. And so whether that's transmission, whether it's something else coming forward in the market to replace that resource, that's something that we're starting that process now. In terms of, and you asked another question and I lost it.
Well, this raises an interesting question, and Dan, let me throw it back to you. Because if the capacity changes that you described take place, are things like Vermont Yankee or Brayton Point actually the ownership of that going to say, look, we may not be the most efficient or cost-effective power over the year, but with a capacity market that is much more longer focused, are they going to turn around and say, maybe we won't close Vermont Yankee as a nuclear power plant, as a baseload provider? There may be reasons why it makes sense to stay around in the market.
Sure. In a capacity market, all resources don't get paid the same amount of capacity. So for instance, wind being intermittent gets a severe discount in capacity payment, market outcomes as it should, because it's not, you can't call upon it, right? It depends on the wind blowing until we find sufficient storage solutions, which frankly are very expensive right now, and so they really don't exist. on a commercial school. Germany is a great example of how to get wrong. Germany right now is subsidizing most of Northern Europe with free power during days when the sun shines, because they've subsidized the solar system. It's pretty substantial. It's an outcome that distorts economies over time. It's been on the back of taxpayers in Germany, and so there's starting to become some policy-related pushback against how to pay for that in the future. I think we're far away from that in the United States. The only place that's really getting there is West Texas with wind, the Midwest ISO, and then the Southwest with solar and parts of Arizona and the desert Southwest. So we've got a long way to go before we have to deal with that on a major scale, but it's a consideration. There should probably be a cap on interruptible power that can get paid for in capacity queue.
You talk about the other markets in the United States, and certainly here in New England, it's mostly in a deregulated market. In New Hampshire, utilities still own some generation, so we're kind of a mixed bag in New Hampshire. What are some of the distinctions that maybe you see from an investment standpoint? Is it a regulated market or deregulated market more conducive to the type of investment that you think that people are looking to make in the energy sectors?
It's a great question, and it depends upon where you sit. The reason that the regions that deregulated was because there was a concept that lower of cost per market would yield a reduction in prices paid by customers if there were deregulation. And there was also the general United States capitalist kind of view of the world that competitive markets breed efficiency, and they do. What we've gotten is some systems that are awkward for long-term planning of an energy resource that's reliability dependent. If you step back and you say, well, what makes electricity different? Electricity is unlike other commodities in that there's a cost for not having enough. Right? If you don't have enough electricity, you have a blackout, and it's enormously expensive on an economic scale. In other commodities, you just don't deliver to a customer. And so the tolerance for having too little is zero. Deregulation doesn't cope with that very well, and it certainly doesn't cope with it when you're writing the rules. Frankly, we got lucky. Thank goodness we had the worst recession since the Great Depression electrically. Because if we didn't, it was a train wreck already in place in 2007. You remember when gas prices were looking at $12, $13, $14, and we didn't have a system to build new power plants on a reliable basis. So I think that, your question is an interesting one. For my money, centralized regulation probably does a better job in promoting reliability and reasonable average price. Competitive markets for electricity probably give you a lower overall cost, but with the consequence of higher volatility and weaker reliability. Depends on what you want.
Well, Brian, you purchase for a variety of markets. Is what Dan described kind of your experience with respect to how you might, as an end user, view the market? Do you think that a regulated versus a deregulated market for you makes a difference when you or your companies are thinking about particular investments, either on the energy side or where you're going to put the next 1,000 workers?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly regulated versus deregulated. There's certainly a difference, but I think the primary move, or the primary change, the primary difference is really the cost of fuel. If we're in New England, we're constrained natural gas. If you move outside of New England into upstate New York or Pennsylvania, natural gas is trading at a negative basis to the Henry Hub in Louisiana. So natural gas and electricity prices are very, very inexpensive, not too far from here. And so I would agree that a regulated market from an investment perspective certainly has market certainty to the investor, which is always good if you're looking to invest. You did make a good point though about we absorb the volatility in the restructured, deregulated markets. We see that volatility. We're exposed to it. We're in the middle of it right now. But at the end of the day, overall prices do tend to settle down, and generally they settle a little bit lower at the end of the day than probably the regulated counterpart, if there is such a thing in New England. I mean, I guess Vermont's still fully vertically integrated market. So in terms of your second part of the question, the sourcing decision as far as where we locate jobs and where Fidelity is going to sort of invest its next major operation or data center or whatever, there's a lot of factors that go into that decision. Energy is certainly one of them. It's not the highest on the priority list, although it's reasonably high. But it's economic development, state incentives. A lot of folks want a lot of economic development centers in various states would like to have a Fidelity Investments set up shop and build an operation in there. So that a lot of the states compete very aggressively for the business to move, to get Fidelity to relocate to their regions. So energy's up there, but it's certainly not the top of the list.
Well, Lisa and Dan, I think you may have some perspective on this as well from the investor side. When your clients or large investors are looking at locating facilities, looking to build an industrial plant somewhere, I assume that they take into account things like, well, take the Fraser Mill story that came up over the weekend. They look at that and they say, wow, volatility in natural gas, which is typically plentiful in most places, is forcing them to cut back to 25% of their production capacity and lay off people. How much do those types of somewhat anecdotal, but drive those investment decisions and force people to consider one option of location or another, whether they expand a facility here in New England or whether they move a facility out of New England? Maybe Lisa, you can talk about it, and Dan can jump in as well.
Sure. Well, it continues to show up as top 3 or 5 of issues in location. In New Hampshire, the Business and Industry Association identified top issues, continues to come up: labor force, healthcare, energy. New England Council, energy is in the top 3. So it continues to show up. I think which type of business you're in is going to have a bigger impact. If the more energy intensive you are and the tighter your margins are in the industry, like in the paper industry, you can't afford to run. Now, you could hedge and get a fixed price, but you'd be paying such a premium for the whole year to have that certainty of price that your business couldn't be competitive. So you really have no choice in industries that are that energy intensive that just cannot run and be cost competitive at a steady price given the volatility that's going on. The premium will just be too high. Now you get it, you're a very large, Fidelity is a very big business now. Your hedge and the spike hurts, and I'm sure there's a lot of internal talking, but we're not talking about something that's 30% of your cost of doing business is in energy. So I think across the board it affects decisions. It continues to show up in the business community surveys. Whether it's 1 or 2% of your cost of doing business or 10 or 15 or 20, that is going to make a difference. I think something else, one other piece of that, not only what percent it is what's the outlook? And I think that's the new story here in New England that's really different. It's not just high prices with something on the horizon that's going to change that. There's these great proposals. We saw 11 proposals on the list, and you were pretty negative about how long they've been around and whether they're coming to fruition. We have pipelines that aren't really coming on board. So there's not something at the end of the story to give confidence. So I think that adds to the concern about making those siting and investment decisions, because not only do you have something that's a high price that you're looking at, you're not sure how long it's going to be high and when it's going to change. So I think even though we're years away from solving the problem, just because that's how long it takes to build something, even if it were 100% permanent today, which it's not anymore, we don't have anything that we can at least know about. So I think it's more than just throwing up our hands as a region and saying, well, we were so many years away from solving it, that it's not going to impact the economy. The issue is that businesses have to look forward, and if there's a plan in place and that something is moving and one of these projects actually can break through and get approval and get the funding, depending on which side we're talking about, the transmission or the pipeline side, then I think we'll see some relief and some businesses will hold on.
I think she's exactly right on site selection. Let me answer a bit of a similar question, but a little bit different angle. So we talked about really significant infrastructure needs in New England, and there's a real desire to invest in infrastructure. It's sort of it's a global thematic now, is infrastructure investment. And so why aren't we seeing, the dollars parked right here? And part of the reason is it comes down to alternatives. So we've talked about the issues of New England, and we're talking about stabilizing a region where prices are high and unfortunately probably could go a little bit higher in the intermediate term. Okay? If I were to present that opportunity to fix that problem to you as an investor and give you an alternative, which is there's going to be, on paper, a 10% expansion in natural gas demand in the United States in 2018 because of refineries and LNG facilities all leaving from the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. Which one are you going to bet on? It's so much easier to bet on that one. And that's where the money's flowing. And that number's not wrong. It's about 70 Bs a day of delivery. We've got 10 to 12 Bs a day that we're going to use in refineries or export in Lake Charles and the Houston Ship Channel. That pays. And so that's where the money's flowing right now. So we need to find a way to make New England as attractive as that and to attract Fidelity and to expand those businesses in this region.
Well, you talk about making New England more attractive to these types of investments, and clearly one of the critical issues here is the siting, the permitting, the regulatory environment, the coordination amongst 6 states at times. And let me turn to you, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit more about, in terms of these infrastructure, potential infrastructure programs. Can you talk a little bit more about ISO's role or lack of a role, and how ISO can or cannot move the process forward to make what the experts think are the better infrastructure decisions for the region?
Sure. They have a clear role when there's a reliability need. If you look at the transmission projects for reliability, we have a process. We're required to study that and put forward, working with the transmission owners, put forward projects. And so when we go through state siting procedures for those projects, the ISO is there to support the reliability need for that project. But it still is the transmission owner that takes that project through the state process. In terms of generation units, new generation units coming on, that's where we have a role in terms of getting our market rules to be clear, to provide those price incentives. And it's interesting, we did have one project come through our capacity market in Boston. It's called Footprint Power, and it was to replace one of the retiring
Salem Harbor.
So it was much needed in that area. It cleared our market, and that was the first time that our capacity market had price separation with a new zone, and so there was a higher price there showing the need. And so that resource did clear. It is now facing some siting challenges, permitting challenges.
Legal challenges.
Legal challenges. So it remains to be seen whether that can actually get built. It would be great to see it get built. It came through the markets, and it is needed in that area. But in terms of gas pipeline, that's not our role. We don't have a gas pipeline role.
Do you want one?
Not really. We don't want to be in the fuel supply business, especially when you're dealing with market participants. Some are natural gas, some aren't. And so how we would allocate the resource and supply to a certain segment of the market is not where we want to be. We have had some conversations with the New England states as they've started talking and looking at ways to promote the investment in gas infrastructure that they've talked about, potentially flowing costs through a new part of the ISO tariff. It would be a very novel approach. It's something that we've had, kind of been scratching our heads on, about our role in this. But if it really is the ISO acting as a billing agent, basically, to collect costs that then flow to get pipelines built, that is something that I think the states are interested in at least discussing. We'll see what happens with that, but it might need something like that to get those long-term investments in infrastructure made in this region.
Let me ask you talk about reliability, and we've seen with Salem Harbor, our reliability, ISO clearly said we need this. Whether it's converted from coal to natural gas, we need that generation, that location. You came out this past week saying would prefer Brayton Point not to shut down. Where is the decision marker on those things? Is it purely just the economics of the various zones in the region where you're looking at this and saying there's going to be curtailment issues, there's going to be transmission congestion issues, therefore we need this project? Or are the decisions being made looking at the queue and the future of generation in the region and saying, we need this diversification of the generation, because if we don't have it, we're not going to solve the problems that we've been seeing over the last several years.
Yeah, and we don't play a role in diversity. We basically let the markets bring forward what the markets are going to bring forward. In terms of letting a resource leave, it's really a very technical review of what would happen in the system if that resource wasn't there. So it's a very technical. We don't look at the economics. We don't look at field diversity needs, and so we make those determinations, and then what the resource owner decides to do with the resource, then we plan for whether it's transmission to cover that for that reliability concern, or if it's something else that comes forward in the markets. There's been a lot of discussion on whether ISO New England should have a broader role in determining fuel diversity for the region, and we really feel like it's the marketplace, and the marketplace should bring forward the most efficient resources. We try to come up with tools to deal with what we have, but we don't want to necessarily select a certain, 20% of this and 20% of that.
We have a few minutes left. Let me move to a broader area. Certainly energy is beyond the region, is a very national issue. And with what goes on in Washington, for better or for worse, impacts energy here in New England. And there is a lot of new regulations being proposed, whether it's something along the transmission side of FERC 1000 rules, whether it's something like EPA rules on emissions, cross-state emissions regulations. Lisa, maybe you can talk a little bit about, looking forward, how these regulatory issues may affect energy costs here, and then maybe Dan can weigh in on the investment standpoint and how investors are looking at this and what the potential impact is for ratepayers, both on an industrial and manufacturing side, as well as the average family who may end up paying for these changes.
Okay. Well, I think, again, in the short and medium term, these are going to do nothing but drive up costs. They have to. There are more regulations. You're forcing shutdown of plants. It'll decrease supply. You're forcing increased compliance costs. In the short to medium term, that's going to drive up costs. So it really comes down to, where is that taking us to? Is it taking us to where new projects, bringing in gas supplies from outside of the region into the region, bringing in the hydro and the wind from outside the core New England region into it? Is that going to happen or not? Because with these increased regulations and compliance, that's going to drive up costs. If we were doing something on the other side to bring it in, then over the long run, we can end up with a more efficient, cost-effective, and reliable system. But that's what the big challenge is, and I think that there may be some relief in slowing down some of these regulations. I think some of the New England states have gotten together and said, hey, wait a minute, we're already doing a lot of this, don't double count. and pile on another layer where we're already doing all these regulations that are already embedded in our cost structure here. So why should we take it yet again, and other regions are lagging in those levels of compliance? So I think it is a challenge in our collective effort to have the cleaner, cheaper, safer system. We need a glide path to get there. And unless we're going to start seeing some breakthrough on these new infrastructure investments in New England, the piling on of additional regulations, I think, is just going to accelerate the cost problems. Because we're not really seeing the relief. I mean, we haven't heard actually ideas coming out to accelerate the building and the siting and regulatory structure of the new sources that we need to bring in. We're seeing most of the regulations to chase out, and this is happening in New England as well, chase out the ones that we want to get rid of collectively as a society. So I don't think it's a positive outlook in the short to medium term.
Couldn't agree with you more. 4 big items in Washington that we're watching. The first has to do with natural gas and what we're going to allow to be done with. And there's dual paths there. Is there a federal role for regulation of fracking? Right now it's at the state level. That's been reasonably effective, but on the margin there are bad actors, and if you do end up setting up a federal regulator for that, it will be costly, guaranteed. The second path is how much LNG should we allow to be exported? So we're as a nation going to become an exporter of fossil fuels. We've approved 6 or 7 Bs to date. It looks like we're going to approve another 2 or 3 Bs very shortly. Should there be a limit on that? Now, the reason that matters is gas here is circa $4 an MMBTU. LNG global market is something on the order of 4 times that. If you close that arbitrage gap, it's good for the producer, it's good for product of America, it's really bad for our local prices. So big issue on gas. Second big issue is on transmission. So we've decided that this whole competitive ethic should be extended to electric transmission. I already talked to you about what's been extraordinarily effective in New England, which is reliability-based transmission sheet clearing. Great job. All right. What hasn't gotten done? Merchant. All those projects on the board haven't gotten done. Now, what the first talking about is going to merchant. Not for everything, but for enough that on the margin, we don't know what those rules are, how it's going to work. We don't know who's going to qualify as owner. We don't know what kind of financial restrictions are. And remember, you build a transmission line. Average transmission line's got a 60-year life. Frankly, it's probably longer. So you get a merchant enterprise to build a transmission line. Are you sure they're going to be there in 60 years to take care of that thing the next ice storm that comes through? You got to figure that out. So the FERC is moving there with FERC Order 1000. Big jump ball. We don't know how it's going to work. A lot up in the air. Third huge issue is carbon. We, as a firm, believe that there will be a notice of proposed rulemaking issued this year by the EPA seeking to regulate carbon emissions from existing sources. We think that the legal path is very challenging, but there is a legal path. We aren't going to be able to use a mandated cap and trade program. Not to get too wonky, but you can't do RGGI nationally. That was thrown up in the courts. And so it might end up that the feds hand each state a cap, and they say, you figure it out. And back to your point, some states have already done a darn good job reducing their emissions. Well, do you start from where you are, or do you start from some arbitrary number and you're going to change economic outcomes doing that? That's going to start this year. Probably take 5 or 6 years to get through the courts. And then the final biggie is, should the feds subsidize renewables? I don't believe they should. I think it should be done locally, because I think we make some bad siting decisions by putting a blanket number out to subsidize a resource. And while I absolutely agree with the infinite industry argument that was the premise for what we've done, we've been subsidizing wind now for 20 years. When do you pull it away? Same thing with solar. My view is now, let the states decide who are closer to the action what they should subsidize and at what level through contracts as opposed to feds. That's coming up this year because the PTCs for wind just expired. Watch the tax expander bills. All kinds of nice cube that can go in those. That's one of them. Watch Coon's bill for qualifying renewables for MOPs. I think that's the right way to go. And then in 3 years we're going to do the whole thing for solar. So I think those are the 4 big items to watch Washington on.
Well, at this point in time, we have about 10 minutes left. I want to open up to the audience for questions. I do ask that before you ask your question, wait for I have 2 gentlemen here who are going to be supplying microphones. So wait till they get to you so that we can all hear the question. Right here. Coming on this side right here.
Good afternoon. I'm from industry. I have 4 comments I would like to make. The Northern Pass, I think we're taking up, we've been closing down dams in New England for the last 25 years, and now we're looking to buy power from dams that are up in Canada. So it doesn't make sense to me. Another point I would like to make is the recession that was started 5 years ago or 6 years ago. What that did is it took out the weakest companies, the weakest technology, and shut them down. The newer technologies that are being developed, particularly in New Hampshire, because I'm from New Hampshire, for solar power generation, was sent to China, where China made this huge infrastructure of building solar panels, and now they're coming back to us. And we're taking our money and sending it overseas. Another point, if it would be possible to have the gas bought, the natural gas bought in the May, June, July timeframe and stored in storage tanks in New England, we would have sort of like a battery where when we needed it, it was there. And one other point that I'd like to make is we should probably buy 25 square miles of mineral rights in northern New York where they have that Marcellus shale, and then we could just pump the gas into New England, and there you go. So I'm from industry. We have to solve our problems on a daily basis. We don't have months or years to solve.
It raises an interesting question. Let me talk about the 3rd point that you made, storage here in New England. And perhaps Ann or Dan may be able to address that, or anybody on the panel for that fact. We don't have a whole lot of natural gas storage here, which is typically why we see the constraints and the volatility. But maybe you can talk about what we do or do not have.
Yeah, I was going to say that unfortunately we just don't have the geology to store the gas like other regions in the country do. There are some liquefied natural gas storage, both the District Gas facility in Boston and then Canaport in Canada are large LNG facilities. And then the LDCs have their own LNG, small LNG type storage. But you really need to have huge LNG tanks to support the natural gas storage. And as Dan mentioned, LNG on a global market is priced on a global market, and it's much more expensive than the resource that is to our west.
The price of plastics is going down because of all the natural gas that has been found in the United States. So, because that's where the plastic comes from the natural gas.
Well, and it's really, it's interesting being in New England, and as Michael mentioned, I was a commissioner in Connecticut when the first kind of wave of high natural gas prices started coming, and there was a lot of people upset that we couldn't figure out a way to make New England a cheaper place to live and do business because of our energy costs. And so, but we said, but we're nowhere near the source of natural gas, and so it kind of made sense. Well, now it's at our doorsteps. And so we don't have that excuse anymore. We really should be able to, bless you, we really should be able to get to a place where we can access this lower cost natural gas, because it really is resulting in huge economic benefits for every other part of the country. And New England sits here with the big price difference.
Yeah, and to follow that up, I mean, I think if you see even the development of compressed natural gas capabilities now, emerging in New York and Pennsylvania now with trucking solutions into New England for smaller. I mean, it's certainly not at the scale it's going to make a dent into the generation market, but you see these solutions cropping up more and more now, and you just wonder at what scale will that exist at 2 years from now, if for some reason the AIM project, 2 or 3 years from now, if the AIM project doesn't come to fruition or doesn't come online or doesn't make the capacity issue as good as people are hoping it does. So there's other technologies that are coming along that sort of help that storage solution.
Other questions? Right here.
Thank you. David Murakaki, House Science, Technology, and Energy Committee. One of you folks was talking about Germany needing to export, etc. Angela Merkel actually exacerbated Germany's problem by directing the shutdown of nuclear power plants. That cut down the baseload generation capability, which the Germans replaced with coal-fired power plants. Since the entire reason, I think, behind renewable energy is, at least in theory, to try to reduce carbon production, doesn't the replacement of nuke with something that's not nuke essentially harm the goals of limiting carbon production? And should New England be thinking about retiring nuclear power plants with new ones? New nuclear power plants tend to be smaller, more efficient, distributable, et cetera, the type of units that we use in our nuclear frigates and submarines, and a half a dozen of them in nuclear power, aircraft carriers. What are your thoughts on that?
We're currently building 2 new nuclear power plants in the United States. One's in South Carolina and one's in Georgia. They're both Westinghouse AP1000s, and they unfortunately are going to come to market about 2 times what a natural gas-fired power plant would come to market. That's with subsidies, so that's optimistic. It's probably closer to 3 times if you unload it. Those states have made a decision on fuel diversity. They're still regulated states, and they have an integrated resource plan. New England would have to, or somebody would have to take an inordinate risk such that I don't believe that you would get over the finish line to propose a nuclear plant and get it built, given the competitive marketplace that we do business in.
Are you saying the political environment in New England is not conducive to having a nuclear plant?
I didn't want to make an announcement.
We had such a good time with the last one. Other questions?
That's the problem, but yeah, I mean, so that brings up the problem of, well, why wouldn't we let Hydro-Quebec deliver hydro? Because that's also a zero resource. Because the alternative is probably more natural gas, which is an emitter, even if it's a low emitter.
Gentleman right here.
Magnus, also from House Science and Technology. I'm tempted to get into the nuclear debate, but I'll let it go.
We'll save it for another day, Bob.
But I did want to ask a couple of things. To the extent we've got a short-term, we hope it's relatively short-term problem with these constraints, to what extent do you foresee that demand response can address that? That's something I don't think one of you mentioned a little bit, but there's a potential there for a lot more of that. And is it something we should get going? How do we do it? And the second one, I'm just kind of curious, particularly in light of what Mr. Ford said. Do you think the fact that New England went so big into deregulation of electricity, do you think in the long that's turned out to be ill-advised? And we should consider going back to a vertically regulated system like we had for 100 years? Those are my two questions.
Great. And you want to take the demand response?
I'll take the demand response question. We have had more demand response. Several years ago, we've had more. We've seen a lot of the demand response go away. I think that there is the capacity for a decent amount of demand response in New England. I think the markets have to get to a certain level to support the demand response. We've seen them leave the markets because the markets there was excess capacity, and the capacity market was clearing very low at the floor. I think as we see excess capacity leave the market and the price rises, I think you'll see demand response come back. And so I do think that there's a big role for demand response to play. How that helps on the natural gas side, I think is unclear, because really demand response plays a much bigger role in the summer. It's a better resource in the summer. The winter months, there's just not as much demand response that's out there to help with the situation, and so that's where you see more of the natural gas problems. But there is a big role for it, and I think it will come back once we see the markets, the capacity market in particular, get to an equilibrium place without this excess capacity.
With respect to your second question, maybe I'll throw it back to Dan, who I think you initiated the discussion about the regulated versus the deregulated environments.
Yeah, it's a really interesting debate, but practically putting the genie back in the bottle is impossible, because you'd have to go back out and reacquire the resources at fair market value. Who's going to foot the bill? Who's going to do that? So you have the inverse of the problem you had when you deregulated with stranded cost recovery. You have stranded acquisition cost.
Other questions? Mr. Arlinghouse. Wait for the mic.
I was wondering, somebody said, but Lisa said that we're 40% above people, and I know our rates, and we're like twice Missouri. Seems like if you're a big power user, there's no real incentive to locate anywhere in New England. And what are the three things that you would do, anybody, to lower our rates? Is it possible to get our rates, however drastically, down 40%? Or should we just tell big power users to go to Missouri?
Interesting question. I mean, is there something, I'll make you all king for the day, one day. Is there something that you would recommend or do that would help alleviate some of the price pressures with respect to energy here in New England? I know what I would do.
Yeah.
Natural gas access.
Yeah, build pipeline. Yeah, there have been some studies on building pipelines and what the impact that will have on energy market prices, and it's pretty amazing. If you do increase that supply into the region, the capacity into the region, it has a dramatic effect on energy prices year round.
Is there a second item, number two? Transmission coming down from Canada for hydro?
Hydro access,
yep.
Because of the Quebec and resources.
We have one more question. I'll take one more. Anyone? Right here, gentleman down front.
If we got the transmission line of Hydro-Quebec, would that relieve the gas load to make, we're a large electric user and a gas user. We're off peak. We use gas mainly in the summer, which has been rewarding, but we do see the spike in electric rates. But would that stabilize the electric rates, and would that fill a percentage of the void by getting one of the projects at least?
I think it would have an impact on rates. Anytime you're adding a large new resource, it's going to have an impact on the electricity prices. It depends on what Hydro-Quebec is pricing their commodity at, what the market is clearing at. If there's no natural gas infrastructure built, and we see these price spikes, then they'll likely be in the market, and so that they would have an impact on wholesale electricity prices. It's not going to alleviate the concerns with natural gas reliance. I still think you would need to have increased capacity from natural gas to be able to maintain the natural gas fleet in the region.
With the shutdowns and without Northern Pass,
Yep.
2018 is a train wreck.
Yes, I would say, 2018.
Technical term.
Yeah. I wouldn't use train wreck.
Unfortunately, Ann and her cohorts are going to have to man it. So. Well, look, I want to thank the Institute of Politics. I want to thank everyone for attending, and I certainly want to thank my 4 panel members here. Hopefully, you've all learned quite a bit today. And then I think we have cocktails in the lobby afterwards. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. By the way, that there were appetizers and some food outside if you'd like.